This is a revision video for paper 1, section 2 practices, and it's on Catholic liturgical worship. The first thing to say is that in the exam itself, it might say liturgical worship, and that just means Mass. So you actually need to learn that those things are the same. Liturgical worship is almost always going to refer to a Catholic Mass. This is quite an easy question in lots of ways, because as soon as you look at it, you should be saying in your brain, yes, it is. So let's start off by writing down everything we can think of about Mass. Okay, so just off the top of my head, that's what I've come up with. It's something that happens every week. It remembers Jesus' death and resurrection. It's where the Eucharist happens. Obviously, we're going to, again, as usual, we're going to talk about it being the source and summit of the Christian life. There's a command to keep the Sabbath day holy, so it's kind of a rule that you have to go. Well, it is a rule that you have to go. You need to have been baptised to take Holy Communion, so there may be some reason why you can't take Holy Communion, and the whole point of going to Mass is really to be before the Eucharist. It's the community gathering together, so there's some kind of strength about being together as a community of people who all believe the same thing. And then maybe something like hearing readings about Jesus' life, and the priest explains them. So you hear the gospel readings, and then you have the priest kind of trying to help you to how to apply them to your everyday life when he talks about the homily. So if we were to try and put this into some kind of order, we're obviously going to need to start off with a yes point and finish with a yes point. I'm going to go first of all for the idea of it being weekly celebration that gives grace. So let's start with this idea. It's a weekly celebration that gives grace. The grace comes from the Eucharist. Okay, so if you wanted to, you could give a very brief outline of things that happen at Mass. So you could talk about hearing Jesus' word, you could talk about the penitential. I'm going to try and keep it a little bit simpler, and I'm going to say it is a precept of the Church. So it's a rule of the Catholic Church to attend Mass. And it's God's command. So your two quotations for this, one is slightly more in depth than the other. So you could talk about how the Catechism teaches those who fail in this obligation commit sin. Or you could keep it a bit more simple with keep the Sabbath day holy. So what we're basically saying is not only is it something that's beneficial for us, but it's actually something that God commands. Now in terms of developing that into some form of evaluation, this is a strong point. You know, it's an extremely strong point, so I wouldn't want you to, it'd be kind of heretical for me to say that you should argue against it, in fairness. So we're going to say it's a strong point. Because celebrating Mass and receiving Jesus in the Eucharist is going to give you the strength to live your faith for next 7 days. The quotation that we're going to use to back this up is one that I really like, and just to make it clear, not every Mass is going to end with this particular line of liturgy. It's the one that I always choose if I'm planning liturgy on behalf of the priest, maybe for school. So it's go in peace, glorifying God by your life. There isn't anything more important for Catholics really than Mass, other than possibly baptism, and we'll come to that as our disagree in a second. So weekly celebration that gives grace through the Eucharist. You could possibly give a brief outline of what happens in Mass, one sentence I would say. You have to, so it's God's command that you need to, it's the Pope's command that you need to, the Magisterium's command, and then we're going to round that off by saying celebrating Mass and receiving Jesus in the Eucharist gives you strength to live your faith for the next 7 days. This is backed up by go in peace, glorifying God by your life. So we need to go on to a disagree point, and I guess there are a couple of disagree points that you could use, and so I'll look at them really, really briefly in turn. And one of them would be the idea that there may be a reason you can't attend. So if you are a mum or a dad and you have to work in order to pay for your children, that wouldn't be treated in the same way as being a grave sin, because actually the most important thing would be to keep your children alive, because it is a vocation to be a parent. Okay? You could also argue that baptism is most important because it is the door to the other sacraments, as you know, hopefully. And you can't take Holy Communion until you've had your baptism. So another kind of technicality, really, I suppose. And then another no point that I really like is the idea of Jesus said, wherever people speak about him, he is there. So could argue that formal gathering isn't needed anymore. And that's as part of something that we call the New Covenant, which is why we would say we could ignore the old part of the Old Covenant. We could maybe do that because Jesus' covenant cancelled out some of the rituals. It's a shaky one in terms of theology, but formal gathering isn't needed anymore because he says, when 2 or 3 are gathered together, there I am in their midst. So it's very, very similar to the Shekinah quote that you know for Judaism, paper 2. Now, we're going to have to evaluate this. We're going to have to think of some kind of way to disagree with this, because Catholics would not support this idea at all. So if we think about the idea of Jesus said wherever people speak about him,